Welcome back to Modern Education. This is your host, Benjamin S. Woodford, back in the studio for another live broadcast right here at the station underneath Memorial Auditorium at the KZSU studios. I'm here in Studio A with my co-host.
Hello, this is Emily Quiles.
Emily Quiles is back on the air with me for another week of Modern Education. We're going to do a little bit of discussion of learning and all kinds of cool stuff today. I think we will have at least a few tangents, as we always do.
Like always.
And whatever you're doing right now, we hope you are having fun tuning in, whether you're listening over the airwaves on 90.1 FM here in the Bay Area, or if you are streaming online on the internet, anywhere in the world you can listen to us, which is pretty amazing, isn't it?
Oh, it's great.
I'm kind of amazed by that.
That we can get to any listener around the world who finds us on the interweb.
I agree. And, you know, I'm throwing this word out here. I'm not throwing out the world.
What knowledge?
I'm throwing this word out here, amazing. And I think that word is overused a little bit. You know, it almost loses.
It's one of those words that's just nice to say. Amazing.
I know.
That's
it's the
amazing.
Z, right? It's like even the word like zone, right?
There's not many words.
Yeah. Like even just like if you're making a bee noise, like a buzz, right? It's fun. Yeah, I don't know. If you have like a really good sound system in your car right now, I think that probably sounds even better.
You can hear the bass of the zzz.
And if you are on the commute home or sitting around the pool or somewhere in Alaska fishing, any of these things, you could tune in and listen to us every Friday at 3 p.m. Pacific time. If you would like to contact us here in the studio, you can always call in or text. We love the text because they're really easy to manage with all the other things going on. At 855-723-9010. You can also get us on the Twitter at KZSU or at KZSUDJ. We're on social media, Modern Education, as well as Modern Education on KZSU on the Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. Follow us, reach out, see what we have going on. We'd love to talk to you if you are a community member that has something to introduce us to in the world of education. And what are we going to do today, Emily? What are we talking about today?
So we're going to kind of look into the way that ideas change over time.
Interesting. What do you mean by that?
So this is kind of the idea of like a collective mind, a collective consciousness to the ideas and how we build on each other. And we're going to specifically look at blues. And so how blues, how those forms of music, as well as lyrics to tempo, how all of these things have built over time and developed, which is actually really quite interesting to look at, like the genre of jazz. And like I find like to complement it to the way of how things change. I kind of always before saw it as like a continuous singular
this, like, real progression over the years. It's really special.
Blues and jazz.
They're like cousins, right?
A little bit.
Yeah. So this is I think this is a pretty interesting topic, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've been having a debate if there's a difference between blues and jazz before the show started.
Obviously, there's a difference. Yeah.
I seem to be of the opinion that there is a difference.
Yes.
Anyway, if you have an opinion on that debate, you can text us at 855-723-9010. I'm confident that you'll agree with me, but Emily is, more agreeable in general, so maybe you could agree with her too. So we're
agreeable in general.
I don't know. Okay, so we have a lot of fun here in the studio. Today we are talking about ideas changing over time. Now, there's a lot of examples of this. I think you can look at almost every single part of human existence and see how ideas have changed over time. I think for me, what stands out just right now off the top of my head for the longest running idea that's changed over time is the idea of God and religion. Mm-hmm. It's pretty interesting to think of all the different versions of the Bible over the years. I mean, the King James version kind of got a hold in the world, but that's a fairly recent rendition, and that is very aptly named the King James Version because it was contracted by King James to be his version of what the Bible should have looked like. So anyway, so this is not, I guess I'm trying to set the stage for and bring in the idea that ideas are constantly changing over time, and there are big ideas and small ideas, and they constantly evolve.
They're building upon each other and kind of like this bigger evolution of an idea, of a sound, of knowledge.
Exactly. And it's such a hard thing to trace, and it's such a hard thing to know where an idea began or where it's going to end, or, you know, the progression in between, because each time a person takes a hold of an idea, they make it their own at some level, right? And one of my favorite professors here at Stanford came up with an idea, which we have talked about before on the show, called distributed intelligence. And it's the idea that humanity is constantly passing on ideas and technology and ways of thinking and acting, and all of these things are culturally passed down. They're technologically adapted and advanced along the way. Each generation, each new person, even, I would even, like I say, a generation is too big of a unit of analysis, right? Each person that gets a hold of a new idea really does change it.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of one idea at the moment of how Edward Muybridge, he was basically confronted with the question, okay, so when a horse trots, are all 4 feet on the ground? And this was commissioned by Stanford, the one, the only Stanford.
We're fans of Stanford.
Yeah. And basically, so it became a debate because, like, I'm kind of stemming off of the idea of who, like, where does it begin? Who got the idea first? And basically, Stanford took credit pretty much for Muybridge's work, which turns out that all 4 legs can be are in the air when a horse runs.
See, we could have settled that so easily with digital photography.
Well, that's how it started.
Right?
This is the beginning of cinematography.
Oh, wow.
And basically,
did he make that thing that spins around and it shows the horse trotting as like one of the first moving pictures?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
So he set up, I think it was like 24 cameras in one like line, and as the horse ran past all these strings, it would trigger the camera. Oh. And so he captured individual like photos, shots, and then put them all together and found that the answer, which is, yes, the horse is in air at one point, which was groundbreaking at the time. And basically, Stanford later on took it saying, look, this was my idea. I told you what to do. I gave you all of the material. You just did it.
Sure.
And so, like, the idea of, like, where things start
where's the line, right?
It's also, like, just really difficult to talk about because it could be multiple influencers. Like, I think in general, most things aren't just one person. It's built up on, like, you need, for example, in this case, you need somebody who has the money. You need someone who has the technology, like the ability to work with cameras in this instance. And it's just really, and like I also was looking at, so just like evolution over time and who gets credit for the idea of survival of the fittest and all these things.
Right.
And like, if you trace it back, it's just like, it's really, I don't know, it's unclear, but we all have the idea.
Yeah. And I love this example because there's so many examples embedded within it. Mm-hmm. This guy needed funding, sure, but he also needed a camera. Right? So if someone hadn't invented a camera, he never would have been able to create this sort of backwood technological advance, which he made, which seems pretty simple now, right? Okay, you have a couple tripwires and they just walk by and hit the triggers, right? But that was probably revolutionary at the time, right?
And then spinning it in a cylinder thing to make it move as you look at it was another, oh my gosh.
Right. And so this is, you know, there were probably people who had done things like that where they had, you know, chained pictures together. I mean, flip books and things like that. Yeah. Those probably existed already, right? I don't know. I don't know either. But what I'm saying is there's always this amalgamation of different types of technology and knowledge that come together when somebody makes something new.
Oh, yeah.
And that is in the essence of a distributed intelligence, because the intelligence that went into the camera was just as important as the intelligence that went into the tripwire setup, which was just as important as the idea of lining all the cameras up together. And without any one of those having been invented and already built and available, then there would be no final product of determining this other question, right? And people think that, or I think it's a popular way of looking at invention and innovation and think, okay, this person is a great person because they invented they're Thomas and Edison, and they invented the light bulb, right? But the reality is, I mean, even Thomas Edison, he didn't invent the light bulb. He paid a lot of people to work in his lab to invent the light bulb.
Exactly.
Right?
It's not just one mind.
Yeah, exactly. There is no such thing as a single solitary person that is great, because even the single solitary person that is great is building on, and they say standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Everybody that does a great thing is really standing on the shoulders of giants already. And I think it's a mistake for us as a society that we keep looking at individuals and try to build up and celebrate the single individual who did the one thing that we kind of know about that seems cool, instead of recognizing that they're always standing on the shoulders of giants. Why don't we re-celebrate the giants that are propping them up? Or why don't we stop celebrating the individual and celebrate the entire group that made that possible, right?
Yeah.
Like, why don't we ever talk about all of the professors that worked in Thomas Edison's lab? Nobody knows their names.
Yeah, and this starts in education, the way that we're taught it. And like our history textbooks just list one name and the idea. That guy, that date.
Yeah.
It happened then.
Sensationalize the person and the idea and forget about the actual process. And I think it really, I love this word, obfuscates the reality of what happens in the world. Yeah, I love that word. It's one of my favorite words.
Word of the day.
Anyway, so we're going to bring this back, I think. We're going to talk about this in the context of the blues, right? Now, the blues. It just doesn't mean that we're sad, though. In fact, I think the blues is one of those great genres of music that is talking about sadness and loss and a lot of the horrible things in life, and yet it always brings a positive twist and kind of a way of living in that sadness that's actually more positive than how it all started. And the blues itself is a really interesting example to think about the progression of ideas, because when it comes right down to it, the blues is one of those pure things that have developed in this country, developed in America for the most part. But definitely the blues have traces and roots that go back to some of the African drum beats and certain scales and things like that. But the real reality is that the blues developed as a cultural invention of people living in the South, generally slaves. Or shortly after slavery, still, living in many conditions that were not much different than slavery. So it's a unique example because things like mathematics or language, at least documented scholarship on language, they generally have an origin that we can trace back to some tradition, right? And there are some of that in the blues, but the reality is also that the blues developed itself. And there was no formal training for it. There was no sheet music for it. People learned this naturally through cultural exposure and appropriation, and they did it in a very natural, organic way. And that is an interesting opportunity to analyze how an idea can change over time, because now the blues within 100 years have become so pervasive that they're not very popular anymore as like a mainstream type of music necessarily.
Unfortunately.
Well, there's still plenty of, there's actually a great blues show here on KZSU, which you could definitely look up and tune into on the schedule. But in general, it's not hitting the top 50 anymore on the pop charts or whatever. But that's not the point. The point is everything that is in the top 50, a lot of the different types of music that we do consider popular music now are very much evolved from and derivative of the blues. And yeah.
And in what way exactly? Like I'm thinking of your typical, I don't know, Cardi B.
Sure. Well, so here's the thing. It's harder if you're not familiar with music to know kind of what's happening. But for instance,
more like the flow in the verses.
So for instance, much popular music uses kind of a 3-chord structure, which is very much a product of the blues, using kind of like the tonic chord or the root chord, and then the 4 and the 5 chord within this progression is just like a very simple way to build up tension in a song and then turn it back around and keep going. And that happens all the time. I mean, rock and roll is basically taking the blues structure and turning it more into a rockin' version of it, right? And much pop music does very similar things with the chord structures. They're not going to like follow a 12-bar blues pattern, but that's not really like the essence of it. It's this sort of simple chord progression that's really easy to follow and doesn't require a lot of sophistication to get started, as opposed to jazz, which is a much more sophisticated connection of different chords and a lot of progressions that meander through different sounds and then come back. And so this simple idea of the blues has really permeated a lot of popular music. And it's an interesting progression, at least. So what we're talking about now is we're going to look at one specific song, and we're going to kind of maybe play a little bit of some of these different versions as we go along throughout the hour.
There's a lot of different versions of this one, which I find really fascinating.
Yeah, in fact, we heard one at the top of the hour right before we came on air. We were just trying to give a little bit of setup for the show, and we don't have enough time to play all the songs, so we figured we'd get one in when we had a chance right before the hour started. But that was Hambone Willie Newbern. And he got that name for a very interesting reason. Do you remember what it is? Hambone?
You have to remind me.
Yeah, he used to play slide guitar using an old cleaned up ham bone.
That's right.
Yeah. So you can imagine sitting out on the porch, learning how to play the blues, cleaning off your dinner ham bone and putting it on your guitar. I guess I would imagine they probably let it dry for a couple days before they used it. I guess. I don't actually know. I've never played really guitar at any level that would give me any kind of authority. But it's pretty cool, right? So he got this nickname, Hambone, for playing slide guitar with a ham bone. And he used to do these medicine shows, which are sort of a legacy within the history of Black culture in this country.
Yeah, this part was when I was doing some research on this, was really interesting.
Yeah.
Of just how basically they would travel around with blues musicians and have it as like a marketing, advertising, like it's kind of like almost the first of what we see today. It
was the precursor to commercial breaks, right? Yeah, absolutely.
And they did medicine, correct? And
or snake oil or alcohol.
Yeah.
I mean, they definitely were like traveling shows and salesmen, right? And that was the nature of business back then, because you either had a shop or you were a traveling kind of tent sale, right? And so he used to work at these, and he mentored a lot of the great blues musicians in the process, and was a teacher to a lot of people that came and went through these medicine shows. And he played a song which was called Roll and Tumble Blues. Now, this song we have the first recording of a version of this song, and we're crediting it to him, but it was probably around even before him. And that is the truth of a lot of things, songs, these traditional.
Yeah, the first who got recorded.
Yeah,
which wasn't as accessible back then.
Exactly.
It completely changes like documentation. Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up about being accessible to record, because the reality is, the person who gets recorded is generally the person who gets credit for it. But many of the songs that we know and love from artists, especially, older recordings, they may not have been an original song. It may not have been their song even, but these songs were so recycled and passed around and changed and adapted that, the beat may change a little bit every time you play it. The words may be slightly different.
Yeah, when I was listening to all these different, I guess I almost want to say covers of the same song.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
They sound so different. Like not one song sounds the same, because they even, like you're saying, changed the tempo, changed the lyrics, just everything. But as well as under the same name, with the same sort of intention with the genre and the music, and like what they are doing for the audience, which, I mean, right? The jitterbug. Everyone's jitterbugging.
Yeah. And it really is interesting to see how many different variations there are, and yet still retain the essence.
Exactly.
I mean, think of smartphones.
Okay.
Right?
Where are you going?
Smartphones, pretty much since the iPhone came out, every smartphone is some version of the exact copy of the iPhone, right?
Yeah.
And And the funny thing about that is each one of these tries to make a new evolution, right? Each new version, each new thing tries to add a little something extra. And I think it's funny to think of the novelty of a new idea versus the slight variation and tiny incremental improvement of a familiar idea, right?
But is that, it makes me wonder though, if it's only, like, that's the only way we genuinely, how we progress is incremental change. It's never necessarily one big boom in your face. This is completely different. It's more like,
there's a lot of, there are a lot of examples of drastic or disruptive change, they like to call it,
disruptive,
right?
Yeah.
Right. But, I think incremental change is probably the more common thing, and that is because of exactly what we're talking about, this idea of ideas. That was smooth, Mr. Woodford. But the idea that as your thoughts and your creations are used over time, they are going to grow, and it's not as sexy, right? It's not as sexy as a brand new idea just popping up and being like, I'm brand new and shiny, everybody wants me, right? Instead, it's this slow crawl to perfection. And I think that is, I like disruption a lot, but I think the reality is this slow crawl to progression is something much more attainable as far as long-term real change, right?
I mean, I've thought about this before in like kind of a metaphor, so bear with me. I hope it makes sense.
Okay, I'll metaphorically bear with you.
Okay, so basically, in the sense, if looking at the Olympics, how, like, for example, a runner, every year someone breaks, right, the world record.
Oh, yeah,
and every time it just gets pushed further and further and further, it feels like. So I feel like that is almost like the way that things evolve. We always want to go one step further, whether that be like milliseconds further. It's just one thing, like step closer to something a little bit more advanced, a little bit faster. And at least for me, that's how I've seen kind of like technology growth, how it's grown is just like these, we got to go faster now.
Yeah.
We got to do this. And it just, if we think about a runner in the Olympics, at what point will it be that they can no longer pass that millisecond mark?
0 seconds. It is the floor of achievement. You
Like,
can
how are we
never
gonna
go
get
faster
there?
than instantly. Okay, so I'm glad you brought up this 4-minute mile thing, because there's a really famous story behind the 4-minute, or you brought up just running in the Olympics, but there's a really famous story behind the 4-minute mile. It used to be thought that people used to believe there was an answer to the question you just asked. What is the floor? What is the absolute fastest? And many, many people believed it was 4 minutes. They believed a human being was not physically capable, and there was plenty of scientists that tried to come up with very technical explanations of why this might be true, looking at stride and joints and all these weird things. But the reality was that everybody at the time before this, which was pre-1954, they believed that the 4-minute mile was the unbeatable benchmark. No human being would ever pass it. And then, what do you think happened?
Someone passed it.
No, she's so blasé about that. She's like, somebody passed it.
Of course,
Duh.
as soon as you said it. Like, the 4-minute mile is so fast.
She knows me so good. She's like, I already know where you're going with this. Anyway, so Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile.
What time? You don't know?
Like 3.99 probably. I'm
Is
not
that
even sure.
the fastest documented?
Okay, actually, no, it was 3.59.4. Actually, what am I talking about? I have it in my notes right here. So Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, and I believe it was within weeks afterwards, somebody else had broken it as well.
Yeah, I'm just looking up here. The fastest it looks like is 3:43:13, which is like really impressive because my mile is 11 minutes.
Oh, that's pretty bad.
Yeah. So I'm looking at this, I'm like, whoa, how do you do that in 3
You're
minutes?
walking the mile at 11 minutes, right?
Oh, no. I'm still running.
I would have expected better with those long legs, but what am I
It
going to do?
doesn't get me that far. Just tripping over them.
Yeah, well, that's life, right? Anyway, so I believe that this is a really powerful example because it showed how the progression was really dependent on a very key piece, which was not whether or not it was possible. It was whether or not people believed it was possible.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. Nobody could beat that record. Nobody could do it until somebody did. And then as soon as that one person did, people just kept breaking that record.
But it makes me wonder, like, at what point, I mean, I guess we're getting a bit off topic, but like, what point will we get to where it's just too fast? Like, once we get to 2 minutes, it's like,
well,
no one's, I
mean, I'm going to throw out there to confound your argument altogether. What happens when we give people bionic legs?
That shouldn't be in the Olympics, at least.
Well, you know,
we're no longer human.
Bionic Olympics. Let's do this. The Cyborg Olympics coming at you all the way live in 2028.
28, okay.
Yeah.
9 years away. Let's go. I'll start building my robot.
I'm calling it now. Cyborg Olympics. Let's do this. Anyway, so I don't know if anyone can ever answer your question. What happens when
Only time will tell.
What happens when athletes are using steroids or other, there's always these like gray areas of, is this really breaking human achievement once we start, upping people's ability to do more than is naturally possible? I don't know. It's a good question, though. It's a fun question to think about, too. What is the ceiling? I mean, people have been thinking about this in terms of brain growth, right? I mean, you've seen the movie, what was it, Limitless? Have you seen that movie?
I don't think I have.
Anyway, it was a great movie where they gave this guy a drug that made him super smart, right? And, limitless, right? His brain was just started using everything. And in fact, it's a very, it's a misconception that your brain only uses like 10% of its capacity. Your brain is lighting up constantly with every single thought. And we have work happening in every single area of our brain. It is absolutely a urban myth that you only use 10% of your brain.
It's funny because I've heard so many people tell me this. Like,
yeah.
You still believe this?
Well, that's the thing about myths is sometimes they can be more powerful than fact.
Than the truth, yeah.
Because we know them. And what's familiar to us seems more real. In fact, there's a study that happened where they were trying to determine how much they could get people to basically recognize someone as famous just by simply having exposed them to the name before. So what they did is they sat people down and they had them read names out of the phone book. And then they had them come back 2 days later, and then they showed them a big list of names and asked them who was famous. And they found that you were statistically significantly more likely to say someone was famous if you had just seen their name 2 days before, which really goes to show this, this idea that the myth or the familiarity can actually outweigh the reality or even the memory or recollection of a fact.
Yeah, just seeing it.
Right.
Will kind of distill it into your brain.
Right. It's kind of crazy, right? Yeah. It's
something
fun to think.
Kind of almost don't have control of, it feels.
Yeah, and you know what's even funnier? If you believe that you remember something and you tell the story a few times, you will physically morph the memory that you have in your brain.
See, this messes me up because I think about the ideas, my own memories, and how that changes. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you, it's a little weird to think about, but it's actually a really powerful tool for change. Because if you think about it, by retelling a story new each time, you are creating a new memory of how that story happened. Now,
they say every time you think of a memory of some time, you change it every time.
Right. Now, think of someone who grew up with a hard childhood and trauma.
Yeah.
They may choose to hold on to the pain that they had, and that could haunt them for their entire life. But if they start rewriting those memories and they start finding new ways to tell those stories that paint them as someone who grew through the experience, paint themselves as someone who wasn't the victim and things like that.
It's basically therapy, isn't it?
It basically is. Yeah, we're rewriting our memories to make sure that we have a story that isn't hurting us anymore.
Yeah.
Because when we identify deeply with a story and that story is hurtful, it sticks with us and it hurts us.
I think this is a really good point to kind of go off of how in blues they typically take on stories of pain that could be in-house, personal, and as well as like typically done with love, heartbreak, and just overall like that. The way that these stories are told is like through pain and then it transforms into something a little bit more powerful, like addressing the pain and working with it.
Yeah.
Most of the lyrics take a turn.
Yeah,
at the end.
It's a really powerful way to rewrite the story, and I think especially that was important for African Americans post-slavery, because their story was it was robbed from them. Right. And the story was rewritten by the masters, and people coming out of slavery were struggling to find where they fit in the world. They were struggling to find a way to have their own culture. And the way a lot of that actually ended up playing out, and this shows itself a lot in blues music, is talking about freedom to travel and freedom of sexuality, because these are two very big issues that people who were in slavery didn't have. Freedom to travel was absolutely not a thing. You feared for your life if you traveled, because you were usually running away from a master. And same with sexuality. They didn't have control or choice in who they would mate with or marry. And these are things that are fundamental to the human experience. So when people didn't have this, they wanted to take back those stories. And so it makes its way into the blues music in a very prevalent way. You hear a lot of these common themes about getting on a train and, you know, taking a bus or just getting out of town, and my woman did this or my woman did that, right? These are the stories that were very meaningful at the time, because they were new elements of choice within the lives of people who hadn't had that the entire time.
So should we get into some of the lyrics of Rollin and Tumblin, or Tumblin and Rollin?
I mean, should we play a song?
Let's do it.
Oh my gosh.
Let's get
we're
little
gonna play a song. Okay.
Sample of kind of what we're talking about.
This song is by the late, great Muddy Waters, one of the greatest blues musicians that ever did live, in my opinion, one of the greatest that ever was. And we are going to play his version, which is not one of his most popular songs of all time, but it was certainly a good one.
This portion of the radio show was deleted due to copyright reasons, but you can tune in to KZSU 90.1 every Friday from 3 to 4.
Okay, that was a little bit of Muddy Waters and Rollin and Tumblin, which is certainly a classic, and we are here talking about the evolution of this song in particular as an example of how ideas change over time. Now, I think we were going to go next and talking a little bit about apprenticeship. Now, apprenticeship, I believe, is probably one of the oldest versions of passing down knowledge from one generation to the next. It predates formalized education and schooling. People were apprentices long before schools even existed, other than maybe clergies. Even before clergies, I believe. So apprenticeship is a long-standing human tradition of ways of passing on and appropriating knowledge, and in fact even training and bringing people up to be the expert, learning directly from the expert, which I think is really a lost art at this point in life. We do not have nearly as much of this formalized connection where the student and the master sit down one-on-one for years on end, learning the craft and passing on the secrets.
Would you say that's kind of just been substituted by like institutions such as colleges?
In a lot of cases, yeah. I think we've tried so much to package and scale up education, that we have really given away some of the traditional apprenticeship models. And they are very rare. It's uncommon nowadays. I mean, even when I was an apprentice plumber, and this is my first career, right? I used to do commercial construction, and before that, home construction. And I was an apprentice for a couple years or a little less than a couple years with my uncle. And I actually had an experience where I was one-on-one with the master, and going along doing things and learning every day with one single teacher there. But that's rare. And I think maybe it's definitely not happening in professional worlds nearly as much as it should. You might get a mentor when you get hired at a new job.
Yeah, how about like internships then?
Yeah.
Would that be considered? I mean, my own thoughts of it behind, but
sure.
Like I guess it is a way of...
Did you do an internship?
Oh, I'm doing them now.
Okay. All right. Well, what's your experience been? Because I can honestly say I've never done an internship.
Maybe I think in general they can be great or terrible. Like, it really just depends on how it's structured.
Yeah.
So if you because the whole point is for you to learn. It's not for you to really be the company benefiting from you in your work. So what I have found helpful, at least in one of the internships I'm working at with a local newspaper, is that every time I finish an article, I go right up to my editor. He reviews it with me, and I'm able to, kind of visually and work through things. I mean, I like that aspect, putting aside financial means. That's basically, yeah.
Yeah. And that's a long-standing thing, that internships serve a really unfair purpose for a lot of people, because internships are generally unpaid or very low paid.
Yeah.
And the excuse is that people are getting, they're getting experience, they're getting access to people that are more knowledgeable. And that's true.
Yeah.
But the reality is people should still be getting paid for their work. And this internship thing is a really great model, but it only is great for certain people, right? It really only serves the needs of certain people within the relationship.
Yeah, really, though. Interestingly, in the UK, they actually, I want to say about 2, maybe 3 years ago, I'm going to go closer to 2, that they recently passed a law where they cannot have an internship that's unpaid. It can be minimum.
Progress.
It can be a little bit, it can be less than a minimum, but it still has to be paid.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think there is not nearly enough protection. There are not nearly enough protections in place for people who are in positions that are, I don't know how to use this word, or I can't think of another word, so I'm going to use it, like in subservient positions. I mean, for instance, I am in that position right now. I'm a grad student, and grad students, for the most part, aren't getting paid. We are studying.
You are paying.
Yeah. And I mean, actually, I'll be honest, I have a pretty good deal here. So I am at some level actually getting paid to do some of the work that I'm doing here. So I'm very grateful for that opportunity, and it's definitely not something I'm complaining about. But that's not the case for everybody. Many grad students are paying thousands of dollars to be there. Then they're doing free work for their professors and their advisors and not getting paid for that either. And then a lot of times their work is getting used without even really giving them the full credit they deserve. They may get a half a line mention in the acknowledgments of a publication, like, oh, and thanks to my grad students, for all their help.
And I feel like this has kind of perverted the idea of mentorship, like how to bring on ideas and pass them on knowledge. It's kind of just been some fast form, free form idea of, okay, you give me this, and I'll give you this, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, transactional, right?
But it's not valued through money. It's ideas.
Right. And it's funny too, because there's not really any, I would say, any real intention or framework set up to be able to formalize the process of passing down knowledge. And that's what school tries to do. And that is what school has attempted to do. I mean, many people would argue maybe that it has failed, or it has at least not done a very good job. But at the same time, I mean, it's the best we have at some level. So don't knock it till you try it, right?
True. I guess you can consider the internet our new wave of mentorship. YouTube.
That's a little scary. It's true,
Anyone
but it's a little
can
scary.
Be a blues. You could be anything.
That's
expert.
True. That's true. And
how many times have you heard someone say, just Google it and you can learn? And that's impressive to me. Yeah,
well, this is a great topic, because I want to bring it back to blues for a minute, and I think I can, right, with what you're talking about. See, look, I'm redirecting off a tangent now.
Where are we going?
Usually you doing that. Okay. Now, so one of the case studies I looked at for Rollin and Tumblin is Eric Clapton. Now, Eric Clapton has at least 2 versions of this song out that are pretty popular. One in his early days with Cream, which was a breakout London rock star band, right? That's where he kind of gained his fame as a guitar god, guitar hero, I think is the term appropriately. The
OG guitar hero.
Right, and later on he did another version in his Unplugged concert, which is a very famous a famous concert that he put on. It was MTV Unplugged, and he really did a bunch of great old blues, and definitely, I think, outdid his Cream version, if you could ask me. But the reason why I'm talking about Eric Clapton is because you were just talking about Google and YouTube and how much that supports learning, right? Now, that wasn't always there. So what did it look like before Google and YouTube? If you kids out there can remember that there was, or even know, if you can remember before you were born when there were no cell phones.
Can you remember? No.
What? Nobody can remember before they were born. That's crazy talk. Okay. Now, Eric Clapton growing up didn't really have an apprenticeship model. He wasn't growing up with, he wasn't in the South of America getting tutored by the likes of Hambone Willie Newbern or Robert Johnson. He wasn't in the scene. He was sitting at home in England with a cheap guitar and a tape recorder and some old blues records. And so he didn't have the access to culturally appropriate the music that he was learning. All he had was the ability to hear some of it, some very select recordings, which he had to listen to over and over and over again. And then he had a tape recorder so that he could record himself. And of course, he had a guitar. Now, it's really easy to say, yes, Eric Clapton is a god. And in fact, many people have said that. There was even a graffiti campaign in London in his heyday saying Eric Clapton is God. So, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's not true, but he's...
Did they also say that he sold his soul?
Oh, well, there is a...
Which I find really fascinating how that's always played out.
There's a long-running tradition of talking about the devil.
Well, exactly.
In the blues, and especially selling your soul to the devil for some supernatural mystic power. And there are many cases of famous blues artists who actually claimed and said, such as Robert Johnson, the late great, one of the pioneers, and definitely Eric Clapton said he was one of his biggest influences. Robert Johnson is well thought of and known by most to have sold his soul to the devil for the ability to play the guitar. And the reason why that actually came about, I'm just totally taking this away for you here.
Yeah.
The reason that came about is because he had been playing guitar around some of his mentors. I can't remember who the mentors were, but they were some of the other big names in the blues. And they said, you're not there, man. You're not ready. And he was pretty crushed, and he walked away.
So
and
he
went and hid somewhere for about 6 months.
Okay.
And just played and played. I mean, nobody actually knows what he did.
Yeah.
Presumably, he sold his soul to the devil and came back the next day. But the reality was he was gone for a while.
Yeah.
And when he came back, the boy could play. And when he came back, everybody was just so floored and so amazed at what this young man had done in such a short amount of time. They couldn't fathom anything else.
Yeah, like what happened in those 6 months?
Yeah, there's no way he learned that much and came back that good. He must have sold his soul to the devil.
It seems a bit dramatized to me, but
fun,
I like
though,
it.
Isn't it? It was so much fun to think about that.
Kind of that idea has been existing for a very long time.
Exactly. As long as the idea of the devil's been around, there's been the idea of making a deal with the devil.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yes, people have said that maybe Eric Clapton did the same because he was such a prolific and amazing guitar player. I think he's still alive. I'm pretty. I think he is.
I'll trust you on that.
I think he is. You can text us at 855-723-9010 and let us know if Eric Clapton's still alive. I'm pretty sure he is. I hope he is. But where we're going with this is the idea of apprenticeship not being an option for everybody. And sometimes appropriation comes from just whatever affordances you have near you. And to be able to grow and develop and build up this new skill, it's in many cases, it is about finding the right affordances. What are the supports you're going to need? What are the technology supports you're going to need? What are the physical supports you're going to need? When are you going to need to find...
It's a lot of factors.
Right.
Yeah.
When are you going to need to stop and say, okay, I need to go see a show or find a teacher or get some help or go to the library? When can you get what you need off the internet? When is it time to buy a book or take a class, right? These are levels of intelligence when you're looking at trying to learn something new. And when you understand that there are all these multiple ways of learning, You can use technology to support your understanding, like getting on YouTube nowadays, which is probably the current version of what Clapton did with the tape recorder. You can take Skype lessons online for different things now and literally get the best teacher in the world somewhere else in the world to help you. And all of these things are intelligent ways of looking at acquiring the information you need to be able to, achieve whatever goal it is you have at that moment.
This idea is talked about a lot in what I studied in journalism. And this term citizen journalism is actually used a lot now in the sense that anyone can be a journalist, and citizen being just anyone. And so if you publish something, you're technically documenting what journalists typically were doing. You're doing what their job almost. And typically as well, journalists will use citizen journalism to do their work.
So when you say citizen journalism, you're talking about like blogs and
it could be blogs
and
it could be
YouTube
tweets.
Channels, tweets. Yeah. Okay.
It could be, you could post something because a lot of publishers and magazines, newspapers are looking for people to publish. So you could have like pretty much very little experience and put it out there and they'll publish your work. That's an example. So it's just overall, like, it's kind of like this mass mind. We're in like this world where anything is possible for anyone almost.
This is actually
kind of more.
Yeah. But this is actually a big deal because having voice is one of those things that hasn't been possible for many, many people for much of human history. And opening up technology and being able to broadcast ideas across the internet has really, really revolutionized who is able to have a voice. And a voice is a very important thing because if you are trying to learn something new and you don't have any way of sharing it, you don't have any way of interacting with it outside of yourself, that's a problem. Now, there's a great philosopher, a contemporary philosopher, and I've just been reading his book, so I'm going to bring this out because it's so wonderful. Paulo Freire, he wrote a really influential book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed.
Okay.
And he talked about voice and how voice is, sort of the equalizer in between the oppressed and, those who hold power. But more importantly, it is also a responsibility of a citizen who wants to be interacting with their own society. We need to have a voice. We need to speak our voice. We need it to be heard. And, when he wrote this book, that wasn't possible, but I think it was prophetic because he wrote it long before any of these things were reality. And now they are a reality. Now it is possible for anyone to have a voice. Now it is conceivable for someone to be effectively nowhere, or as Trump would put it, an S-hole country, which I still hate him for that, but it's not that bad, whatever. I'm not going to dwell. But the point is that this capability has really opened up humanity's ability to show what's happening, right? And people being able to share their stories, people being able to point out injustice. That is another form of ideas evolving over time. And I think with the internet, with things like viral videos and hashtags, we have accelerated this ability for ideas to evolve over time and for ideas to grow and change.
We have more first-person accounts of events, especially when looking at, I'm thinking of the first one that came to mind was like the Boston Marathon. The bombing there. The first accounts were of videos of just people filming, tweeting. That was used excessively to understand what happened. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the new form of CCTV.
It totally, oh my gosh, that's so funny. That's totally true. And it's interesting that is happening because it does really allow a new way of looking at history even. Because
100%,
imagine 100 years from now going to dissect everything that happened. You can do, machine learning algorithms.
Yeah,
and
I've been thinking about this a lot.
Keywords out of the entire body of human knowledge based on every single tweet that ever happened for that entire, year or however you want to look at it. But, we're starting to run out of time, and we had at least one more point we wanted to talk about, didn't we?
Yes. So this is it's actually an interesting evolution of the song that we're talking about with Cyndi Lauper. She decided to cover this song, and it actually kind of brings a nice feminist perspective. I wouldn't say feminist, but feminine perspective to it.
Well, she's an activist, right? She does gay rights activism, and a lot of, she really does try to, I think, maybe live and be the example that she wants to see in the world, which is pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And she did a version of the song, right? And it's a pretty fun version, I think, first of all.
Yeah, I was listening to it.
Yeah. And I think it modernizes the song a lot and really does give her own take on it. I mean, it doesn't sound like any of the other versions, which we didn't even play most of them today, but that's okay because people can look up the song. There's a Wikipedia page where you could probably find every single version of the song that's ever been. Yes, I know there is because I've looked at it.
I'm sure you have.
I love that Wikipedia. I'll tell you. I don't cite it. I don't cite it in my academic work, but I sure do look at it.
It's a great starting point. Yes.
Okay, absolutely. So, should we hear the song?
Let's hear it.
Do you want to hear it?
Let's let the listeners hear it.
Oh.
Give it to the people.
Okay, let's do it.
This portion of the radio show was deleted due to copyright reasons, but you can tune in to KZSU 90.1 every Friday from 3 to 4.
And we are back. Hopefully you loved that version of the song.
Like
and
blues mixed with rock and roll.
Yeah, it's a bit rock and roll, isn't it? She's a lot of fun, though. The song was great. And if you want to hear the rest of it, I'm sure you could find it somewhere on the interwebs. Yeah.
Interweb.
We did it. And we are going to close out another week here on Modern Education. We're here every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. for you to commute home or wherever you're at in the world, streaming us online. If you're catching us on the airwaves, we're on 90.1 FM KZSU Stanford. We always love to be with you here every week on Fridays. You can always text and call us 855-723-9010, and we would love to hear from you on the social medias. We're on Facebook at Modern Education. We are on Instagram at Modern Education on KZSU. And I think is that everywhere we are? We're on the internet. Yeah, we got a website.
I love that you always say the social media.
Social media. Oh, there's multiple of them, right?
The social media.
Social media. I don't know. Yeah. The interwebs. Let's do it. Okay, so I am the host of Modern Education, Benjamin S. Woodford, here with my co-host,
Emily Keelis.
and we will be with you back again next